How might your life have been different if there was a religion for you? A religion that honored you as a woman, as made equal in the image of God. Welcome to Heretica, her eco-feminist theology podcast. My name is Elena and I am an eco-feminist theologian. Please subscribe at theologyofher.substack.com. I decided to finalize this short mini-series on sexual awakenings by referring in more detail to the thoughts of Evelyn Underhill, which I just discovered through researching to create this podcast series. As a result of her writings, but mostly her book, Mysticism, a study in the nature and development of man's spiritual consciousness, which was published a century ago, is considered one of the best books on the Christian mystical tradition. As per Harvey D. Egan's paper called Evelyn Underhill Revisited, he states how Underhill was the English language's most widely read writer on prayer, contemplation, spirituality, worship and mysticism in the first half of the 20th century. By recovering forgotten, undeservedly neglected, and even suppressed texts, she became the first of many scholars dedicated to providing a genuine understanding of the mystical life to a broad public. Convinced that spiritual mystical writings attest to a full-blooded, passionate love affair with the eternal, Underhill insisted that such literature, to be understood properly, must be read and studied with the passion of both faith and love. Interestingly, Underhill's journey began from agnosticism to mystical monism, whereby the mystic recognizes their identity with the ultimate reality, and practices focus on transcending or dissolving the ego, which ego is seen as a barrier to recognizing the underlying unity. And to struggle between pure mysticism and carrying the cross of daily life, and finally to the joys of a fully incarnational spirituality which culminated in both individual and communal sacrificial worship of God, the Holy Other. So Underhill becomes a Roman Catholic as a result of her mystical experiences. Her spiritual yearnings also led her for a few years to participate in the occult Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn Society, which she would later claim opened her eyes to a reality beneath appearances. This is a point I've been making throughout my podcast, that the occult has been criticized as demonic work and anti-Christian, yet in the case of Underhill, as it has been for many other people, it is a stepping stone to, as stated, to open one's eyes to a reality beneath the surface. This led Underhill to become a Catholic dedicated to perpetual adoration. It is therefore, as I say it, not demonic or anti-Christian, but part of the journey to liberation. As long as we don't use the occult and rituals of the occult to manipulate, harm, and coerce others, but as a pure way to open one up to mystical experiences, which may then lead you to orthodoxy, Catholicism, or any other religion for that matter, and to the necessary awakenings for liberation, then the occult can be a very useful part of the journey. So in addition to her most popular book as stated, let's see what her other works were about in short. So Underhill wrote poetry, a genre she considered the crown of mystical literature, followed by 3 novels, one of which was called The Column of Dust, which illustrates how the mystical quest can go horribly wrong if it's embarked upon for its own sake. So it's great to see that Underhill mentions this, as in my previous podcast, part 2 about the renunciate journey, I stated that on this renunciate journey, your central and creative sexual side of your human divine nature takes on an existential dimension where it becomes a way of being in the world, one that interconnects you with the whole world around you. It is therefore not a means to an end, but an ongoing transcendent superconscious journey. So I was expressing the same understanding of how the mystical quest should be an organic process based on what the intention and your values are, and why you want to attain superconscious awareness. It should essentially be a byproduct of your intense faith, love, devotion, and not because it's a fad or you want to fit in with a community to overcome your loneliness, or use the space as a way to harm, manipulate, or coerce, or to make money, and of course, for egocentric purposes. Consequently, the long-term outcome of wrong intention will be devastating on your mental and emotional health. The cognitive dissonance, I assume, and your disconnection from reality and emotional immaturity will become unbearable. So again, it's good to see that there are common understandings about how and why one should embark on spiritual quests. So Egan states about Underhill how in her work there seems to be evidence of long-lasting tension in Underhill's own life. She would question, should one pursue the mystical life of ecstatic consciousness or the loving, self-sacrificing folly of the cross of daily life? As far as my journey went, these two for me were interchangeable. One contained the other. I did feel that at times I was carrying my cross through daily life, because I had a lot of cognitive dissonance and I struggled with the realities of daily life. Yet the layers of cognitive dissonance, although multiple, still were on a surface level compared to the ecstatic consciousness that I could approach, even during my most challenging times. I just had to quieten the mind through walking or elevating it to that space by reading ancient texts. The tension that existed for me was how this was possible. How it was possible that in my most darkest time, I could experience such bliss and happiness. So they are both there at the same time, informing one another. But when you are not educated in this reality of liberation, and you are having the experiences and trying to figure them out on your own, it is a struggle. In her book The Mystic Way, written in 1913, Underhill reinterprets Jesus as a mystic and the early Christians as a mystical community. So it's interesting to see how she goes from an agnostic to a disciple of lover of Jesus, and all through the occult, which brings her to this point. So returning back to her popular book, Mysticism, A Study in the Nature and Development of Man's Spiritual Consciousness, Underhill's emphasis was upon our whole life, not merely experiences. But she looked at it as wholeness. Through this book, Underhill shares 4 marks of the mystical state. First, she says, mysticism is active and practical. It is the art of establishing a conscious relation with the Absolute, an organic process in which the entire self remakes itself under the guidance of reality, and which culminates in the perfect consummation of the love of God. Underhill disagrees strongly with commentators who contend that mysticism is nothing more than an opinion, a philosophy, the pursuit of occult knowledge, or a comfortable basking in the beams of the uncreated light. In her view, it is the most complete and difficult expression of life which is as yet possible to man. Furthermore, the great mystics tell us how they acted, not how they speculated. Secondly, Underhill characterizes mysticism as wholly transcendental and spiritual. It is in no way concerned with adding to, exploring, rearranging, or improving anything in the visible universe. However, the mystic does in fact make the world a better place through spiritual fecundity, and does not, as his enemies declare, neglect his duty to the many. Thirdly, love is the business and method of mysticism, experienced as the reality of all that is. The one is grasped as the living personal object of love that draws the mystic's entire being homeward. Underhill insists that love must be understood in its deepest and fullest sense, as the ultimate expression of the self's most vital tendencies, as total dedication of the will, and as the deep-seated desire and tendency of the soul towards its source. Mysticism's fourth mark centers on psychology. The mystic must possess a tenacious and heroic psychological makeup, a nature capable of extraordinary concentration, which enables him or her to embrace fully the demands of the mystic life. Extraordinary selflessness is demanded as the self is remade under God's guidance. So in her book, she also explains the mystical life with respect to vitalism, psychology, theology, symbolism, and magic. And I'll go through them briefly. Vitalism underscores the vital principle as the essence of reality. It views reality as dynamic and life as subject to constant change, with the mystic's instinct for the absolute. He or she is conscious of being and becoming, and of the transcendence and immanence of reality. When it comes to psychology, Underhill writes, urged therefore by the cravings of feeling and of thought, consciousness is always trying to run out of the encounter of the absolute and always being forced to return. Her distinction between the transcendental sense, that dimension of the person open to and hungering for the absolute, and the unconscious as a reservoir of collective and personal experiences, emotions, and memories, offers an excellent counterpoint to secular psychologies that are close to transcendence. Underhill contends that the mystic's vocation is to plunge below normal surface consciousness, to awaken what the classical mystics have called the ground, apex, spark, and marrow of the soul, contradicting the notion that the disease of hysteria, with its outstanding variety of mental symptoms, its strange power of disintegrating, rearranging, and enhancing the elements of consciousness, explains mystical consciousness. She underlines that a mobile threshold of consciousness may make a man a genius, a lunatic, or a saint. On theology, she elucidates how mystics tend to express their transcendental life in terms of the theories either of emanation or of immanence, that the perfections of creatures either descend from a God who remains strictly other, or that the earth is literally crammed with heaven. So when it comes to theology, Underhill elucidates how mystics tend to express their transcendental life in terms of the theories either of emanation or of immanence, that the perfections of creatures either descend from a God who remains strictly other, or that the earth is literally crammed with heaven and immersed in God. They emphasize too that the goal of the mystical quest is uncreated light, life, love, and a participation in the mysteries of the Trinity and the Incarnation. Contrary to a common and erroneous opinion, Underhill makes it clear that the mystic is neither a spiritual anarchist nor a heretic. So when it comes to symbolism, Underhill delineates these special mystical diagrams, these symbolic and artistic descriptions of man's inner history, his secret adventures with God, that are almost endless in their variety. Underhill states that the images express the deepest cravings of the human heart, the desire which makes the person a pilgrim and a wanderer, the craving for the perfect mate which makes the person a lover, and the craving for perfection which drives the person to be an ascetic in order to become a saint. And finally, in the chapter on magic, Underhill makes a strange assertion, contradicted by the Christian mystics on whom she relies, that magic always accompanies mystical activity. In her view, though magic wants to get, whereas mysticism wants to give. Unlike those who surrender to the path of magic, the true mystic has no interest in the mysteries of life, only in the absolute, which no amount of magic can attain. The mystic knows that only God can teach, and that only the pure of heart can learn. In her book, The Mystic Way, Underhill shares the stages of mystical ascent. She writes about the soul's awakening, purification and illumination, and of the experiences of voices and visions, the gradual plunging of contemplatives into recollection, quiet, contemplation, ecstasy, and rapture. and the dark night of the soul, which urges one to the ultimate unitive life, in which one discovers themselves to be parent of transcendental life. The self-awakening in Underhill's assessment is a form of conversion far deeper than a religious one. Periods of restlessness and mental stress frequently precede this often abrupt awakening to a new consciousness, to a new plane of being, new and more personal relation with reality. So when she speaks of purification of the self, she describes the true lover of the Absolute as one by whom purgation is experienced as a privilege and a joy. One becomes more aware of the tension between the true and false self, and of the web of illusion that blinds one to the unchanging light of internal reality. So this is the true purpose of the purification of self, and it has nothing to do with purity culture as in virginity. She continues by stating that the demands placed on the self during this purification period is adjustment to reality, self-simplification, cleansing and stripping of detachment in the school of suffering love. So as she states, it's quite a challenging period. The consciousness of those in the illumination of the self stage differs radically from that of normal people. So I've mentioned it a few times that you'll sort of feel that you're moving in the opposite direction than other people. Underhill continues that a sacramental consciousness, one transfigured by God's radiant light, knows the secret of the world, in the joyous apprehension of the oneness of light, life, love, and beauty. The twofold expansion of consciousness into God and into the world bestows upon the intuitional or transcendental self an enormously increased energy. Pure contemplation, lucid vision, or automatic expression, and a new power of perceiving a splendor always there, are a few of the descriptions employed by the mystics to describe this state. So you become aware, more or less, of what she's saying, of a very, very subtle reality. In Underhill's view, some prophets, poets, artists, and dreamers have a measure of it. It has its shadow side, the temptation to spiritual gluttony. When she speaks of voices and visions, she explains and exemplifies the three classical types of such phenomena: corporeal, imaginative, and intellectual. Corporeal phenomena are heard or seen with the bodily senses, imaginative ones with the inner senses, and spiritual ones with the soul itself. The first two types, she says, can be fabricated by the self and even by the demonic. The spiritual kind, however, come only from God. So here what she's saying is that we have to have the ability to discriminate. Bogus visions are frequently little more than expressions, but dangerous ones, of the mystic's broken, sinful shadow side. Most mystics do not seek, but fear and ignore voices and visions, except those that enhance transcendental life and transform the mystic into the light and love that he or she contemplates. So basically what she's saying here, and what I understand, is that what's the intention behind why you want to have these transcendental experiences? And based on that, the voices and visions you'll follow will be based on the intention you set. They will either lead you, as she says, to light and love, or they will send you into fear and ignorance. So you need to follow sort of those visions and voices that are more holistic and that enhance your life, that make you a better person. And in Christianity, this is explained through the word goodness. Contemplation for Underhill is the way that the mystic perceives the suprasensible over against itself and makes discoveries, and voices and visions are the way in which mystical consciousness presents its discoveries to the surface mind. They are the soul's artistic expressions through various levels of the psyche, of the sense of God's presence at the spark of the soul. And then what Underhill explains is introversion that occurs through prayer. And it requires quiet, recollection, and contemplation. Introversion, in her view, is the entire process of gathering up and turning inwards of the powers of the self, of gazing into the ground of the soul. So in yoga we call this sort of pratyahara, the withdrawal of the senses. This is how I learned it. And when you withdraw the senses inwards, then you can start becoming aware of your own inner subtle reality, and that's where you can start to be able to discriminate between which voices and visions lead you to goodness and which will, in a sense, create more problems and get you more entangled. It describes connected experiences of a progressive concentration of the entire self under the spur of love upon the contemplation of transcendental reality. So Underhill shares that recollection begins with meditation, which is a byproduct of withdrawing the senses, of this introversion, and it's an acquired art of pondering, for example, the mysteries of Christ's life, death, and resurrection. Meditation for Underhill is a form of natural rather than supernatural contemplation, the first deliberate act in which the self voluntarily turns inward and concentrates. These spiritual gymnastics usually reward the practitioner with deeper forms of inner silence and simplicity. One rule in the spiritual life: the quieter the prayer, the deeper. Underhill maintains that the transition from natural to supernatural contemplation begins with the prayer of quiet or simplicity, also known as the interior silence. So silence is a very powerful tool, but it's also very challenging. So to live in silence and to find that inner silence is a great challenge. In silence, Underhill says, two salient features exist. The self's ability to receive the divine influx increases dramatically, and the self's reflective powers undergo an almost complete suspension. The soul's yearning, its metaphysical thirst, which Underhill maintains is the hallmark of mystical prayer, produces a strange silence that is the outstanding quality of this level of prayer. The mystic's right of pure passivity and emptiness, but paradoxically also of an omnipresent, intangible something that feels their consciousness permeated with both deprivation and acquisition. So I would say that this sort of something that's omnipresent, I would say it's like the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of God, our own spirit, which starts awakening, and we feel, in the emptiness there's always fullness. And this is why mystics are comfortable in their own company. They don't feel loneliness, they're always inspired, because there's always something inside of them that's awake and is inspiring them. Although the surface mind is suspended, the spirit receives a dim yet vivid consciousness of the infinite. In Underhill's view, the prayer of quiet is the danger zone of introversion, the most abused, least understood mystical power. Drawing upon the teaching of Teresa of Avila, she warns of the false idleness and vacant placidity taught by some of the cults of her day. The true mystic never deliberately tries to enter this rest most busy. The genuine prayer of quiet requires an ever-increasing predominance of action over activity, which is both death to all the things of this world and fruition in God. This essentially transitional state is marked by a stillness ruffled by joy. So it is in exactly as she's describing it here. It's a complete emptiness, a complete letting go of the ego, your identity. Everything you thought you were goes away. Fidelity to the Spirit's guidance during this stage often leads to contemplation proper, which transcends the stages of symbol and of silence. In the supreme manifestation of that invisible power of knowing, thought, love, and will are unified, feeling and perception fused together. For Underhill, contemplation is an act of the whole person who, working under and surrendering to love's stimulus, pours him or herself out or in towards overpowering love. Totally absorbed in loving communion with the Absolute, Underhill prefers the terms absolute and reality to God. Unconscious of any acts of mind and will, the mystic's faculties are suspended in what an older terminology called ligature. This passive or infused contemplation is ineffable and noetic. Underhill describes contemplation as a whole but brief act that attains the absolute. The soul cannot doubt that it is in God and God in it. Asleep to the self but awake in God, the mystic experiences a loving and self-forgetting concentration on the divine, an active outgoing self-donation to the divine gift, a divine osmosis between finite and infinite life, all apprehended by way of participation. Underhill distinguishes between the contemplation of transcendence and of immanence. The mystic of transcendence emphasizes the qualitative difference between God and everything else. God is the wholly other, the dazzling and strange, darkness who illuminates the mystic's littleness, unworthiness, and intolerable ignorance. On the other hand, the mystic of immanence boasts of a sense of nearness, intimacy, sweetness, the coming of the bridegroom, adorable friendship, and a rapturous immersion in divine light, for whom reality is a person, not a state. So when Underhill speaks about ecstasy and rapture, she contends that all mystics agree on 2 points. During contemplation, they refuse to give the external world any attention, but in ecstasy and rapture, they are incapable of giving it any attention. Ecstasy comes upon a person either gradually or abruptly, to produce a trance varying in depth and time. It depresses both breathing and circulation, makes the body cold and rigid, and engenders a short period of lucidity, followed by one of complete unconsciousness. Not only in love, but also with love, the mystic's conscious life shifts from the circumference to the center, from surface to depth. Although, as Underhill maintains, mystics unanimously judge ecstasy to be an exceptionally favorable state, they likewise agree that one must distinguish genuine from false ecstasies. Those that are genuine engender psychosomatic wholeness, transforming the mystic and moving him or her further along in the ascent to God. Demonic and self-induced ecstasies harm the person physically, emotionally, and spiritually. The titans of the Christian mystical tradition distinguish between ecstasy and rapture, but often unclearly. In their view, ecstasies develop more or less naturally from a state of intense absorption in the divine vision, while rapture sees the subject abruptly and irresistibly. In short, raptures are simply more violent ecstatic states, which the mystic experiences as quick, sharp shocks. Episodes of rapture cause such a powerful feeling of being taken outward and upward that the mystic is convinced that he or she is levitating. Although seeing and hearing are not lost, everything except God seems far away. This spiritual death and life in God discloses heavenly secrets and enhances both the mystic's physical and spiritual vitality. Although usually brief, raptures leave the mystic dazed and sometimes even crazed with respect to the external world for days, even weeks. In some cases, the remaking of consciousness accentuates the mystic's bodily, emotional, and psychological weaknesses. When it comes to the dark night of the soul, Underhill writes that normal mystical development is an orderly movement of the whole consciousness towards higher centers, in which each intense and progressive affirmation fatigues the immature transcendental powers and is paid for by a negation, a swing back of the whole consciousness, a stagnation of intellect, a reaction of the emotions, or an inhibition of the will. One can say that the enormous effort demanded of the mystic during the illuminative stage produces acute emotional, psychological, intellectual, and volitional fatigue. The intensity of the experience of God's absence of one's own sinfulness and of one's indolence brings about the self's final purgation. In this mystic death, the mystic has no doubt that the spark of the soul has been extinguished, and that he or she has been justifiably abandoned by God. Boredom, callousness, and complete emotional lassitude possess the contemplative. The intellect and the will stagnate, leaving the person powerless to control either thoughts or inclinations. Every vice reawakens to plague the contemplative with evil visions, locutions, violent temptations, and evil thoughts in a privation worse than hell. Underhill focuses on what she hauntingly describes as a dark rapture, an abrupt invasion of a wild and unbearable desire for God. Dark rapture, affected by an intense and painful concentration upon the divine absence, has all the psychophysical earmarks of ecstasy. A parent suffering from the loss of a child, or a lover's grief over the departed beloved pale in contrast to this mystical grief. Moreover, because the self, in the illuminative way, basked in the uncreated light, it erroneously identified the divine nature with the divine light and sweetness which it then enjoyed. This increase of personal vision and joy produced a surreptitious, mercenary love, too much centered on the I, the me, the mine. Because the contemplative confused reality with the joy of it, the gnawing of the soul cuts out the root of self-love with the knife of self-hatred. This enables the self to surrender totally to the great movement of absolute life. And moving now to unitive life, which is the last part, Underhill contends that the final triumph of the spirit, the flower of mysticism, humanity's top note, can be understood only by those who have attained it. Contemplatives write of the unitive life as deification, spiritual marriage, and divine fecundity. As those who have permanently attained reality, they are now ambassadors to the Absolute and pioneers of humanity. Mystically married to reality, they are also mystically fertile parents of transcendental life, who pass on the transcendental life to others. Contemplatives in the unitive life comprehend that their center of consciousness has shifted from the surface mind to the spark of the soul, and that they now live at the deepest and richest level of consciousness. Although utterly penetrated by the Absolute, the self remains intact, like the sponge infiltrated by the sea. The human spirit has become that which it beholds, transformed but remaining itself. Mystics of the impersonal type, according to Underhill, express the unitive life in terms of deification, of partaking directly of the divine nature. Paraphrasing Meister Eckhart, she claims that God says to the mystic, "I became man for you. If you do not become God for me, you do wrong." The deified soul resembles ardent sparks ablaze in the divine fire and partakes of the uncreated and energizing life of this fire. Inundations of uncreated life, of being home, and of foretastes of the beatific vision cause the mystic to sing of her transformation. Although it has become divine in the divine, the deified soul remains humble, neither puffed up nor swallowed up. Contemplatives of the personal and emotional type, in Underhill's understanding, employ the language of spiritual marriage, or the more homely language of the ghostly glue, to describe the perfect union of lover and beloved. The union is fruitful and begets not only children, that is, good works, but also spiritual families, bound to each other by transcendental life. Underhill marvels at how some mystics overcame hostile environments, ill health, poverty, and other acutely debilitating factors to become the great actives who accomplished so much, even from a worldly point of view. The mystic's spiritual reproductive power is, in her view, one of the greatest marks of the unitive life. Underhill insists, however, that the unitive life is much more than a heroic apostolic life, more than divine motherhood of new sons and daughters of the Absolute. Living in God, where it does not live on earth, the self is patient with respect to God, active with respect to the world. The mystic's hidden child has been released, whose simplicity causes the loss of his or her life on the mystical summit. Propelled toward God by inward love, the deified soul is in God by its fruitful inclination to internal rest. Mystics write of the love dance and of their spirit of dalliance, the reality they embrace, and the life they live is described in paradoxical terms, both static and dynamic, transcendent and immanent, eternal and temporal, being and becoming. So finalizing here with Underhill's own words. Mysticism is seen to be a highly specialized form of the search for reality, for heightened and completed life, which we have found to be a constant characteristic of human consciousness. It is largely prosecuted by that spiritual spark, that transcendental facility, which through the life of our life remains below the threshold in ordinary man. Emerging from its hiddenness, it gradually becomes the dominant factor in his life, subduing to its service and enhancing by its saving contact with reality those vital powers of love and will which we attribute to the heart, rather than those of mere reason and perception which we attribute to the head. Under the spur of this love and will, the whole personality rises in the acts of contemplation and ecstasy to a level of consciousness at which it becomes aware of a new field of perception. By this awareness, by this loving sight, it is stimulated to a new life in accordance with the reality which it has beheld. Mysticism is the name of that organic process which involves the perfect consummation of the love of God, the achievement here and now of the immortal heritage of man. It is the art of establishing a conscious relation with the Absolute. The true mystic is the person with a genius for God. So once again, thank you for listening. I hope you have been inspired. I hope you've received some new information that you find valuable, some insight into your own experiences. Please consider subscribing at theologyofher.substack.com. Until next time. How might your life have been different if there was a religion for you? A religion that affirmed you as a woman, as equal to man, and made in the image of God. How might your life have been different? Heretica, her eco-feminist theology educational podcast.